Hello, my name is Ryan Harrell, and I'm going to be reviewing Joseph Williams Jefferson's War, America's first war on terror, 1801 to 1805. So, to give a little bit of background about this, this was America's first conflict abroad off of the coast of the Barbary during this time in North Africa, and it was led by several different merchant republics underneath the guise of the Ottoman Empire. They were vassal states of the Ottoman Empire, and they were given free rein to engage in piracy, slavery, and extortion of Christians and major European powers, that being France, Holland, England, and a lot of the Scandinavian countries during this time. So to get into the book, what are some things that William does good? He very much makes it easier to understand. The It flows effortlessly. Um, he very much goes into a lot of detail about the characters and he even provides a character role, essentially, like a perspective role in their allegiances. For example, he has Henry Knox, who was the Washington administration's war secretary. You got William Bainbridge, who was the captain of the Philadelphia and was essentially the one who was captain of the Philadelphia whenever it became marooned in Tunisia during the war, which was a disaster for the United States Navy during that time. You have William Eatonton, who was the consul of Tunis before the war, and later became a war hero whenever he engaged uh, engaged at the Battle of Derna. And another thing that William does job is, like Hickey's book, he provides a bigger perspective and knowledge of the ships of the United States and their commanders. He gives like a chart of their commanders and the ships and when they were deployed, how many guns they have, and it can also be a double-edged sword since there are so many names of them being non-English origins or Islamic origins, and it's basically hard for me to keep up with everybody since there are so many names mentioned. But he also doesn't just cover the war, he provides a glossary of naval terms that are known for that period or of the 18th century that a lot of people would not know today. And another thing is great about Willem is in the prologue he gives perspective, he gives background of Jefferson and how he feels about uh, Jefferson underneath the administration of Adams, and how he feels about the Barbary States and their continuous, I would say, piracy or an extortion of the European naval powers that is going on during this time. And he also provides background information for the Barbary States, which is another interesting thing that William does. He talks about how they came to the Barbary States under the Reconquista whenever Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain essentially expelled them, took back the you know took back Spain from the Islamic caliphates and sent them back to or expelled them down to Tunisia and North Africa, where they would essentially go and become pirates and engage in piracy and extortion under the guise of Islamic Jihad. So let's get into what William's main ideas are. So one of the biggest main ideas or arguments that he makes is that he seeks to draw a parallel between the current war on terror and to compare that with the Barbary War. And I can see how this can be compelling because he compares to how the Barbary pirates use extortion and they slave anyone they captured and they use them for slave labor and they essentially take massive brigs of ships and sell them off to other major naval powers for money, and they use that income to outfit their ships, build defenses. Essentially, what the um early golden age of piracy did in the Americas. It's essentially extortion, and it's kind of he draws a comparison to that of the early war on terror with everything going on then. And essentially, they try to extort America and they try to extort other nations. And for a lot of these nations, they have to renew treaties by giving money to them. And that's also another thing that Willem argues. It's also important that the whole economy of these states ran on slave population and labor, similar to medieval European serfdom. William states that the Christian slaves were undoubtedly used for harsher condition. William also states that slaves were loaded with chains weighing up to 60 pounds, and Sir Anthony Shirley stated that our beds were nothing but rotten straw laid on the ground, and our coverlets pieces of old sails full of millions of lice and fleas. Willem also states that the Christian slaves toiled in the fields, vineyards, mined copper, they carried water, they chopped wood, and they also took the place of four-legged beasts in the traces of carts and quarried stone under extremely dangerous conditions. Willem also states that slave labor before the introduction of modern shipbuilding, many of them struggled and many of them were sent to be rowers for their masters at the whip. Another thing that Willem states is that the abundance of slaves magnified the atmosphere of unbridled opulence. There were so many slaves that the middle and upper class enjoyed unparalleled freedom. And then they also say that in 1631, the city of Algiers was home to 25,000 Christian slaves from all over Europe, and Europeans would rather prefer death than slavery in the Barbary states. Another main argument that Willem states as a main picture for his comparison of terrorism is extortion and ransoming and hit and run tactics on merchant ships, comparing that today to today's modern terrorism. And another one of these aims that Williams seeks to use this war is to establish the United States Navy, with Jefferson arguing with President Adams the need for a more modern navy and the urge to defend against counterinsurgencies and to have a show of force against the the Barbary states that continue to plague the Mediterranean. William also argues that the war, like Hickey, helped to establish America's national identity, similar to that of the War of 1812 that is widely overlooked, and even further, the Barbary State War is even further overlooked. And there are many different battles and scenarios through this war that help to establish America's identity, similar to that of the War of 1812. One of the earlier situations was the USS Enterprise and its sinking of the Tripoli, which early in the war that brought the morale of the troops up. That victory brought the morale of the troops up. Another later conflict that made another disaster, more like that caused more issues for the or damaged the United States reputation and the United States navies, was the disaster of the Philadelphia underneath the command of William Bainbridge, where they had a logistical situation where the maps were not plotted out right, and the ship, the Philadelphia frigate, essentially capsized or got stuck in the Tunisian harbor, and that caused them to get enslaved. Essentially, William Bainbridge took slavery over he would rather take slavery and protected his men, and rather than all be killed and butchered by the pirates, essentially. And it wasn't one of the biggest or most well-known issues or conflicts that happened was the eventual destruction of the Philadelphia, because the Barbary states, Tunisia, was going to sell the Philadelphia for the highest bidder, and then they also were going to ransom. They also gave an impossible amount to ransom the Americans that were captured, and so Stephen Jr., Decatur Jr., and several different schooners led a miraculously stealthily approach into the harbor of Tunisia and managed to burn the Philadelphia to the ground, in which they were able to safely escape with no casualties caused to them. And this was such a big victory and blow to the United States that William states that the Philadelphia's destruction in Tripoli harbor electrified Europe and America. so much that the victory from Toulon of Admiral Horatio Nelson called it the most bold and daring act of the age. And this even reached the steps of the Vatican, where Pius even said that the move to extol the actions of Decatur and his men, the American commander with a small force and in a short space of time, has done more for the cause of Christianity than the most powerful nations of Christendom have done for ages. And William also states that this is what Jefferson had longed for all these 20 years, to show the world that the United States was different from the old world, that it was a nation of dauntless men that the ship had bore. Decatur and his crew to glory was aptly named and embodied the new nation's spirit. And big conflict that arose, another big conflict that arose during this time that also helped establish America's identity that is really overlooked is the Battle of Derna with William Eatonton, who was the previous consul of Tunis before the war had broken out, and he essentially uh, embarked on a grueling 500-mile march across the Libyan desert, and he essentially hired mercenaries as well as the United States Marines, and they essentially marched 500 miles into Derma. And when they reached Derma, they demanded the city surrender. And when the governor refused, he launched an assault. And the U.S. Marines and Hammett's forces played a critical role in capturing the city. And it actually ends up marking the first time that the American flag was raised in victory on foreign soil. And it actually made the Barbary states um, capitulate and surrendered. However, um, this also pressured Hamet to not be installed, because the whole situation was that he wanted to be installed in favor of his sister, and that's why he joined Eatonton, was to essentially gain back his kingdom. And so essentially the two main reasons that William argues is that this essentially played into America on a national international stage. It strengthened the United States Navy as well as the Marine Corps. It established them on a national stage where they were able to capitulate a thorn in Europe's, essentially Western Europe's side, because the Barbary states have plagued the nations for centuries, constantly attacking, extorting them for money yearly, changing the situation, changing treaties, asking for more money. And the United States showed that they could be a force reckoned with, and that only improved further with the War of 1812. And to quote Willem again, he says that the Barbary War convinced Congress and the American people that the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps were indispensable. Aided by low casualties, little more than 30 killed, and the emergence of pantheon of war heroes, the seafaring services were safe from Congress's budget tax. Men like Preble, Decatur, Eatonton, and O'Bannon entered the American lexicon, and their stories were still being told by candlelight and farmhouse 50 years later, especially in Eatonton's case with the Battle of Durham and Bainbridge's essential destruction of the Philadelphia, keeping the Philadelphia out of enemies' hands. And to quote Wheelan again, he says, when they finished their education in the Mediterranean, they were ready to test themselves against the world's preeminent naval power, which would be England or Great Britain during the time. And so essentially the Barbary War was a overlooked war that helped to establish America's presence to the Western world, as well as to help establish their national identity. The the Philadelphia disaster and the eventual destruction of the Philadelphia actually ended up causing Francis Scott Key to make a song about it, and later on Francis Scott Key would also make another song about the Star Spangled Banner. And so this war is widely overlooked in terms of national identity, to help establish the Navy, to help give more experience to the sailors, and as well as to give America its name. It's essentially to give it the it was originally an underdog nation that essentially had to fight and claw its way to gain European respect. and this war is one of the causes of it, as well as the War of 1812, and they're widely overlooked. So William's argument is very strong and solid because they were able to defeat a major naval power one time, and then they were able to essentially take out a thorn in Western Europe's side.